Great. So hi everyone, hello and welcome to this special RE&D seminar, the Resources, Environment and Development Group at the Crawford School. This is our flagship special lecture for the year, so warm welcome. So my name is Simon West and I'm a lecturer with the RE&D Group. And I'd like to begin the seminar by acknowledging that we are meeting today on the sovereign and unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and pay my respects to Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as to First Nations people around the world and First Nations people here today. So today we're very honoured to welcome Professor Lauren Rickards to join us, who's travelled here from Melbourne today. Lauren is a geographer who has a rich and distinguished record of scholarship around the social dimensions of climate mitigation and adaptation. She was a lead author on the 6th assessment report on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And as well as climate adaptation, Lauren's research examines approaches to research impact and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the changing role of universities, ideas around innovation, and also the interconnected systemic changes that are often referred to as the Anthropocene. Lauren's previous academic roles include Research Fellow at the Melbourne Sustainable Societies Institute, the Director of the University-wide Urban Futures Enabling Platform at RMIT, and earlier this year she moved to La Trobe University, where she's currently Chair of Climate Change Adaptation and Director of the new Climate Change Adaptation Lab. So today Lauren's going to outline the thinking behind this exciting new lab at La Trobe. In the talk titled The Work of Adaptation, the Adaptation of Work, Intricacies and Urgencies of the Climate Challenge. So the structure of the lecture is that Lauren will talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion for the final 20 minutes. That will conclude the kind of formal session, but then we've got lunch outside, so please stay and talk to Lauren and talk to each other for food and coffee and a chat afterwards. A couple of housekeeping items before we start. So we'll be recording Lauren's presentation and making it available on the Crawford YouTube channel afterwards, but we'll turn it up for the question and answer session. And also if everyone attending on Zoom could please remember to keep your microphones on mute for the presentation, that would be great. And then you're welcome to raise your hand for questions or put questions in the chat afterwards. We'll make sure to bring you into the discussion section. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Lauren. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Simon, and thank you everyone here and online for this wonderful opportunity. I've come here from Wurundjeri country and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging and the ones looking after all of the country around Australia. What I want to talk about is the sort of often hidden work that it requires, is required to actually underpin the sort of foundations that we need more than ever in this climate change era. I abbreviated the title on the slide because the one I gave was quite unwieldy. But really what I'm getting at here is something that we're looking to really try to unpack through collaborations with others, I should say, in the new Climate Change Adaptation Lab, which I'm privileged to be leading. And the reason for focusing on work is really what I want to outline here today. And I thank you for the opportunity to sort of think through this. I should say that the title probably should be towards the work climate change adaptation relation, because you'll see that actually what we're doing is really focusing at that sort of prior step of focusing in the first instance on climate change impacts. And this question, the relationship between work and climate change impacts. So clearly work is already part and parcel of the climate change conversation. And I just want to say too that I'm also sort of bracketing out, though very happy to bring it up in the questions, around all of the very important questions around greenhouse gas mitigation, decarbonisation and work. And we see we have experts in the room, which is Beck Pierce, working on these things. But work is also very much part of this conversation about what does climate change actually mean? What are the actual implications and consequences of this new era, this new phase of history that we are in, sometimes referred to as the Anthropocene as well. And part of the focus is on the ways in which some of our work, our paid work in particular, is being undermined. And so we get comments such as this around the standing down of workers due to extreme events such as the floods up around Lismore, for example. The ways in which work is connected here between dairy farms and dairy processors and ice cream factory workers as well. And the ways in which this means that there's a bunch of people who are having their work disrupted. They are therefore, from an economist's perspective, and I welcome input from economists, underutilised, if you like, so unemployed or underemployed. At the same time, we know that climate change and extremes that are playing out right at the moment around Australia are also very much a cause of extra work that sometimes is not being met. And so you have a flip side here, and this is NAB calling out for 3,000 volunteers ahead of the current disaster season. We know that the disaster system, our emergency management system, is heavily reliant on volunteers, but not only that system as well. We also have environmental management heavily reliant on volunteers. A lot of elements of public schools are reliant on volunteers. The health sector is reliant on volunteers. So we have this huge reliance on voluntary work. We know that there's also a crisis in filling that work and actually responding to that need. At the same time, it's not just about who is and isn't taking up the roles. We also have changes within the actual doing of the work. So it's not so much an employment shift here as actually the quality of the work that's being done. This is just one of the indications that things are sort of under strain within our workplaces. And of course, we'd be stupid if we didn't refer to universities here. Clearly, absolutely, climate change is not is one of many, many factors contributing to this, but there is this sense that adding to the pressures is the recurrence and compounding of these extreme events, the variability, and of course, uncertainty about the future. And finally, we also have new forms of work emerging, new forms of work being crafted and created and generated, and I'm referring here something I'll come back to at the end around a kind of a profession of climate change adaptation, focusing here particularly on one group which has become of particular interest for many reasons, but partly because of their work in the climate change space. And there's a quote here from Svenja Kiel, one of my PhD students, who actually had the opportunity to actually do sort of undercover work, if you like, with a consulting team as they went about constructing the climate change adaptation market. And you can see there the key kind of point at the end there is potentially a revenue stream associated with that service. So this is just to give you, by way of a few vignettes, just a few kind of indications of the ways in which our work systems, the different types of work, are being influenced. And so this question is, you know, under climate change, we have a whole range of queries being raised about work. In some areas it's too little, some too much. Is it flagging? Is it proliferating? And so what I want to argue, and you know what our kind of lab is really wanting to sort of work with, is this idea that effective and just climate change adaptation requires a focus on work, really requires a very steady intellectual focus on this. And the flip side of that is that actually effective and just work requires a focus on adaptation as well. It is not outside of the tent when it comes to adaptation. So today I don't have time to unpack all of this, but I just wanted to give you some initial thoughts and really open up for discussion. I'll start, of course, by just setting the scene with a little bit of climate change context. So I should just flip to the back here and ask Mark how to do this better, which is just to make sure we're sort of all on the same page with that. Then I want to really, you know, unpack this question through 4 steps around asking why does climate change adaptation require a work lens? flip then to think about the climate change adaptation work that's emerging and suggest that perhaps there's a gap there that we really need to pay attention to. Okay, so how is climate change affecting us? How will it affect us? That's kind of the meta question that's led us to this focus on work. So just to kind of reiterate that, you know, when I'm talking about climate change and impacts, I'm not in any way trying to infer that, you know, some kind of climate related factor or variable is the only thing in play here. So clearly, you know, with there's a lot of scholarship that IPCC has really pushed forward, really thinking about not just climatic hazards, of course, and of course that in itself is really complex and involves land management and things, as people here would know extremely well as patterns of spatial exposure, which obviously shift over different temporalities as well, long-term settlement ones, short-term evacuation ones. But this key point, the one that social scientists really reiterate, which is these non-climatic vulnerabilities, which is, as I tell my students, everything else. Sorry, you do need to know everything about the world. And what that means is that it's highly, highly dynamic, because that everything else changes moment to moment for each of us, and also at larger scales. And, you know, key among that means that we're looking into the past, a whole lot of inequities, a whole lot of patterns of disadvantage that are sort of set into our current day systems, things such as the precarity of work for many people, health inequities, etc., as well as the kind of successes, let's say, of industrial society, things like wonderfully long and increasingly fragile, complex supply chains. So when you put all that together, you get your climate change risk, then you minus the effect of adaptation, and then the equals. You can tell I'm kind of busy doing primary school maths at home, and then the actual sum is the impact. So that's the sort of like just the broad conceptual framework that we're working with here. There's a whole lot of different variations on this. Happy to kind of debate about whether this is a sufficient one, but I certainly find it's a useful one to make sure that we keep these things all in view. Okay, so let's just really quickly just flip through kind of where we're at with this. So hazards, it's not simple. We kind of, sometimes the social science, we're like, oh yeah, the climatic side. Well, actually, it is of itself incredibly complex, and the science is developing very, very quickly. And what we're seeing is that the science is actually also struggling to keep up with the empirical reality. We keep finding models are broken. For example, you know, just the recent hurricane that, you know, has affected Mexico, for example, proved once again that these models are not actually giving us accurate early warnings, for example. Partly what we've got is larger scale hazards. So that means, for example, that standard or habitual adaptations, such as bringing in feed or water from other regions, doesn't work because they haven't got any either. Or, you know, let's say fire helicopters, what do they call the big helicopters from California? That doesn't work because they need them at the same time. More intensity. Just yesterday, or the day before, had to have our solar panels repaired because of a very intense, small little hail cell that went through and destroyed our solar panels, and took quite a lot of convincing to RACV that it did happen. I wasn't making it up, and it was almost impossible to see on the radar at the time. It was so small, but it affected us and our neighbours. And at the same time, this stuff's not happening in isolation. So the idea that you can specialise in one hazard or another increasingly doesn't work. At the same time, we know that the standard approach to climate change impacts, and alongside that, adaptation planning, which is to kind of draw a circle around a particular place or region of a various, whether it's a city, a neighbourhood, a nation, etc., and then sort of work within that container, doesn't work either. Climate change doesn't like these false boundaries that we put up. And that's partly because not just of the highly dynamic climatic and social ecological systems, but particularly these network systems that we're part of. And so you've got these systems that bring, you know, great advantages in certain ways, you know, I'm sure, you know, if we were to map all of the systems that are enabling this online seminar right now, we'd realise how dependent we are on them. At the same time, we know that they are, you know, as Ulrich Beck and many others have, you know, long discussed, also a huge source of risk, and that's very much being brought home in this climate change era. And, not just in abstract terms, but in very empirical terms as well. So whether it's the storm that hit Melbourne back in 2019, where you had, again, a relatively small area, incredibly badly hit, to the point that for 3 weeks they didn't have electricity or water in Melbourne. The rest of Melbourne sort of moved on and, but, this is kind of like really right there. And then, of course, everyone here is more than familiar about the sorts of things that happened with the 2019-2020 fires and the feedbacks between electricity systems, finance systems, transport systems, which found people stranded in their evacuations. At the same time, and I think this is the really neglected point where I really sort of want to focus our joint collective attention, because I really feel we need a call to arms on this with social science. The non-climatic vulnerabilities are dynamic and shifting and also worsening. So, you see all the kind of scenarios of the future, and it's like, yeah, so this is what the gases are doing, therefore this is what the climate system will doing, therefore this is how things will worsen. That is only one part of the equation. If you actually add the vulnerabilities worsening in there, it's kind of more of a parabolic kind of curve. Like, this is seriously coming at us very, very quickly. And so I will add that kind of requisite kind of note of positivity towards the end, which I know, because you're not meant to like talk in these really dark terms, but I don't know, I'm deep down, I'm kind of also a realist, and I feel like we need to kind of face it and then work out what we can do in a positive light. So one of the things about all of this is that it shines a very bright, stark and unflattering light on Australia. And so that is stuff like the State of the Environment report, all of the incredible trajectories and trends that we're talking about there. They are worsening climate change impacts. They are a source of vulnerability that is then interacting with the additional stress of climate change in non-linear ways to create impacts. And so that has to be part of the climate change story. And I feel like at policy level, that's a huge need, is to bring those policy agendas together. Same time, of course, uneven distribution of health outcomes as well, all sorts of things like our aging infrastructure. I don't know if anyone's travelled by country train recently, but it's an adventure in disruption. And of course, just things like poverty and inequality in wealth as well. So we've got a whole lot of stuff that I think needs to be brought into the climate change adaptation conversation. So we need to reduce impacts by addressing these things. So what that means is that we've got a lot of work to do, and this is the kind of plain English version of a summary of Chapter 11 on Australasia in the working group report that Mark led, and I was privileged to be one of the authors in Chapter 11 on, where we just kind of make the very obvious point that we're seeing cascading compounding impacts now. They're putting huge pressure on our ability to respond. So that idea that we need to sort of respond later is not just wrong because impacts are here now, but because our ability to respond will decline. So we have to respond now because this is when we can respond. And so as we say there, while the work of adaptation has begun, we found the progress uneven and insufficient given the risks we face. I can't actually remember who out of our author group penned that line, but it has stuck with me and has been a motivating force for the way that I want to direct the Climate Change Adaptation Lab. Okay, so just to kind of, by way of wrapping up this introduction, I did just want to also offer a couple of working definitions. Working definition of work is a big word cloud of all sorts of various types and elements of work. So I just want to emphasize that I'm not simply here talking about paid jobs. Paid jobs are very important, we all know that, but it's all sorts of other elements of it. It's the longer term career trajectories of people, for example. It's the informal, unpaid, voluntary work as well. It's the reproductive labour that's required to underpin the productive labour, as feminists have pointed out for so long. It's all of these things is what we need to bring to bear on this question of climate change impacts and adaptation. At the same time, adaptation can be defined in longer or shorter ways. I've gone for just a kind of medium kind of mid-level definition here, efforts to reduce the impacts of climate change and find positive opportunities. And so when you put these things together, I think you start to see, some of the kind of synergies, especially when you think that at essence, work is about purposeful activity. We can work on our own, we can work in groups. Work is just about actually trying to achieve something. And it's actually staggering to me that this hasn't actually been at the heart of climate change action conversations from the start. Okay, the final little piece of the puzzle just to kind of throw in here, and I tried to really kind of, I guess, keep this a little bit disciplinary, agnostic, and not too theory heavy or anything, but just to explain, because it really, I think, articulates a lot of my perspective, it's this sort of social material concept of riskscapes. And so what we're talking about here is that obviously risks as real elements are unevenly distributed, they're physical, they're social, and as Louise Moore talks about, we also very much shape society around risk management and who has responsibility for risk. We have whole sort of professions and institutions set up on the basis of implicit ideas about risk. At the same time, we see risk differently. Not just because each of us is, a special person on the earth, no one else like us, that too, but more the fact that, we all come with learned lenses. And so it's more that cultural construction perspective. And when you actually think about some groups, cultural constructions actually then get to act in on those risks, either to dismiss them, to prioritise them, rank them differently, intervene in different ways, then you start to see that the riskscape actually is a really contested space. And I think this is a really increasingly important aspect as climate change adaptation, not to mention greenhouse gas mitigation, actually starts to really get up and moving. And you've got useful kind of parallel ideas in the mitigation space, such as climate urbanism, for example. And so the point is that actually we've got this constant interaction between what risks are actually being generated and then how we perceive them, how we act, and these flow feedbacks backwards and forwards. Okay, so what I want to do now is step through some of the reasons, and there's only some of the reasons that we really need a work lens when we start to think about climate change adaptation. And as I said, the prior kind of implicit idea of climate change impacts. And that's because by doing so, we actually start to bring into view what I think are some of the really important but neglected risks, as well as adaptation options, and think about how we can actually reshape the material riskscape for better. So let's begin with perhaps the most obvious connection that exists when we think about work and climate change impacts. And that is that some people, arguably all people in different ways, but some people in very explicit, recognised ways are already being impacted at work. So in their workplace is a site of exposure. Their workplace is a site of climate change sensitivity. So there's something about their work is actually highly sensitive to the additional stresses and pressures of climate-related factors. So what we're talking about here is often the very kind of high-profile conversation around outdoor workers. And so, in particular, there's a focus on outdoor workers and their exposure and sensitivity as biological beings to extreme heat. At the same time, there's been quite a lot of literature on emergency services, farmers, particularly farmers as business owners. So it's less about them as people outside working. There's a little bit about that, but more about that fact that they're out there and their business is highly exposed in that primary industry sector. And then continuing in the primary industry sector, of course, there's the focus on energy workers as well, and the policy-induced transition questions and ideas around just transition. So we've got that. We also have, I should have said at the start, a very, very strong focus on people as individuals in the climate change conversations and literature. But just take note how often they refer to you as a resident. Is there any other conversation where people are so concerned about where you sleep at night? It's like a resident here, the residents are affected here and residents are affected there, and they can't afford insurance, or there's a really, really strong focus on where people are actually situated and living. Now, that is clearly absolutely essential. I'm not arguing that it's not, but it doesn't capture the full impacts that are given, let's say, climate-related disasters, such as the ones playing out right now in Southeast Queensland, have on a person. The fact that your house was or wasn't affected to X degree, that your neighbourhood was or wasn't affected, is only half the story. If your work has been affected, and as I'll go on to argue, if your work actually does something in the world, then you're affected, and those who benefit usually from your work are also affected. So there's this whole sort of other, let's say, scope of risk there that we really need to bring to the fore. And so that's one way in which this conversation goes. It's also, I think, worth pointing out the fact that a lot of the stuff that focuses on people's impacts via work focus implicitly on paid work and implicitly on male-dominated occupations. And so you've got there a silencing of a whole lot of important work that actually is the reproductive engine, if you like, of society, that isn't, the impacts on that are not being given the attention they require. So we looked at this a little bit in a piece of work we did back when we were at RMIT called Climate Impacts at Work, where we really tried to centre workers because they are this link, this real linchpin, not only out into the families and the households and the peers, that's absolutely crucial, but and then also the communities and the regions, but also into the sectors and the industries and the organisations. So the linchpin between quite disparate disciplinary conversations, I think you could see from that diagram as well. It was a great piece of work because one of the things we got to do was to sidestep the normal methodological boundaries we put on our work, which is to say working via organisations, which are those kind of mini containers, if you like, and actually say, well, we just want to access workers. And one way we were able to do that was to work with a whole bunch of wonderful unions who have membership across a whole range of different organisations, sectors, types of work. And you can see there that out of the 1,100 or so that we surveyed, we mostly had professional workers, very much not in the normal conversation around impacts on work, climate change impacts on work. We had mostly females, we had a lot of community workers, personal service workers, health sector workers as well. So what did they tell us? Well, they told us that they already, they're their perceptions, they perceive themselves to be already being impacted in a large number of ways. That included the direct impacts. So that whole idea of the workplace as a place of exposure, noting that many were talking about their homes. So this is where you've got a nice kind of intersection between that conversation about where we are as residents, because this was actually done during COVID. So you do actually have then a really interesting conversation about homes as places of work. But, what that means is that, like, if your home is badly insulated, if you're unable to, run the air conditioning, which of course is not the answer, but, we all need to align that at times, then, you've got a source of disadvantage right there. 75%, 3/4 of people indicate that they thought their health had been affected. That's pretty remarkable, because this is not like a group of environmentalists. It's not, like these are from all over. And we ran some workshops and they were pretty, kind of down to earth. Like there was a really great workshop with a bunch of train drivers and tram drivers who were really talking about how they were affected. And that included mental health impacts. At the same time, there are more indirect impacts, and I think these are the ones we really, really have to focus on. Things like too many hours, too little hours, that sort of stuff I started talking about at the start, as well as having to work outside your role. And you have to note that's without the training. So you get the responsibility without the training to do extra things because the other staff are furloughed or unable to come into work. And 2% even talked about having lost jobs as well. So this is about kind of really understanding a churn that's going on in workplaces that I don't think we're giving enough conversation to. At the same time, there's other problems going on. So it's not just the hours and the roles. It's stuff like the clients are more agitated. So the fear of violence in some cases, having to manage staffing disruption. So you're okay, but suddenly your roster's gone. And so nurses were talking about that, for example, not being able to get to work or being late for work, all of those sorts of things, which I kind of helpfully role modeled today with disrupted travel, and blackouts at work, and supply chains are also part of that. And then this kind of idea of emanating from beyond the workplace, in particular, having extra unpaid work in the background going on, that whole sort of COVID thing that really taught us about the complexities of people's lives, all of those responsibilities as well. So we see there that there's this conversation about certain groups of workers being impacted. It tends to focus particularly on direct climate change impacts. But then the story often stops there. So it's like, the number of times you hear about hot outdoor workers, and then the idea is that they are impacted as individuals. And of course, that has an intrinsic value to it, and that's important in and of itself. But then we have to start saying, well, if work is purposeful activity, then so what? What happens when we actually knock that out? Well, the first and most obvious next step, which is actually an area of study, and I have to, again, just acknowledge I'm not an economist, but, the first next step is to say, all right, so that's slowing down the financial flows in the economy. Okay, we've got less coming in here, less going in there. We've got more volunteer work, less paid work, perhaps. We've got, unevenness around all of this. So what's that doing, in different scales? So a local or regional economy, what's that doing in the national economy, etc. And so there's a whole focus on that. So that's work as a source of income, work as a source of capital and flows through. But again, that doesn't quite capture it, does it? If people say, oh, it's so sad academics are not working so much because they've been disrupted, that's less money flowing through the economy. We miss them so much. Doesn't really capture what we do, does it? So we actually have to start thinking in these bigger terms about what it is we do. So again, just the next step towards this, we are also positioned within systems. So, let's imagine, one of us is unable to come to work for a period of time for some climate change related reason. What does that do in our workplace? Well, one thing it does is it pushes a whole lot of work onto other people. Maybe over time it affects students. Maybe those courses then start to struggle. Like, we are part of systems, and so we have to start thinking in these longer term ways. And so when we think about, what happens when we knock these things out, then we actually start to get an insight into that phrase I mentioned at the start, which is this idea of impacts cascading. At the moment, that phrase is discussed in ways that it sounds almost magical. They kind of cascade. But what's actually happening? Well, it's all about system interconnections and interactions. And I think workers are actually one of those catalytic nodes, in a sense, that really, really need to be paid attention to. So if we start to better understand impacts on workers, we start to get one handle on cascading impacts. And it helps us then to start looking into the black box. There is actually a huge amount of really excellent work that's starting to think much more systemically about climate change impacts. And so this work is, for example, by our IPCC colleague Judy Lawrence and others in New Zealand, looking at the kind of urban systems and urban system effects. And you can see here, they're talking about the interactions between financial, social, physical impacts. You've got governance there, and this is all sort of sitting outside of the actual direct climate elements. And so this is the sort of thinking we need. We have to start putting those direct climate effects into the bigger context that they're part of to really understand what they mean. But I put this in partly for Mark. What are the arrows? You can't just have arrows and not say what the arrows are. How do the arrows work? How are they actually connected? And I think one of the connections is workers. And so what that means is that when you also then have, and this is another figure from the same paper, when you also have figures such as this that talk about impacts and then affected services, and then flips to the people community experience. So the community then is the recipient of some kind of impact because a service has been disrupted or stressed, discontinued. That really underplays the role of community as the workers back in that second column. The community experience is actually that they are in those services struggling to run them. So it's about sort of trying to take out people again as these kind of implicit residents here, kind of, oh my goodness, my water system has been disrupted, to say, actually, I work in the water sector. I'm the one actually, trying to manage that incredible stress of having a disrupted, water treatment plant, for example. So we know that infrastructural systems have long been, recognised as these catalytic nodes. And so we know that there's a really kind of long history of looking at it. A lot of it stemming from the military, it has to be said, focusing, literally from the eye of the plane here. So this is the kind of Cold War kind of legacy of the notion of critical infrastructure, which we are now busy rolling out. So just in case you weren't aware, so a lot of climate change conversation in the Australian government sits over in Department of Home Affairs, as well as the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, Water, where there's a big, strong focus on critical infrastructure resilience. Climate change is just one of the kind of sources or drivers of disruption there. But you can see here that they've mapped out what they see as critical infrastructure. You'll be relieved to know that higher education research is on the list, way down. Unfortunately, schools don't make it. Yeah, so, and no kids, certainly no childcare. So if you're planning on being part of the higher education critical infrastructure, but you've got kids, you're kind of in trouble. So anyway, the point is that, this critical infrastructure perspective is kind of disconnected from how things work. How, what actually is critical, right? And again, slightly gendered. And so the definition given by Homeland Security is that critical infrastructure is those things which, if destroyed, degraded, or rendered unavailable for an extended period, would significantly impact the social or economic well-being of the nation. I'm glad they slipped the word well-being in there, but other than that, this is quite a passive approach, right? People are there as the recipients of infrastructure. And also there's this question of, what's critical? So if you look at this picture, for example, what's critical? Is it literally just the kind of built environment, or is it the people working in those areas? Is it actually the people doing the jobs inside? This is something that we're investigating in a project between the Trobe, RMIT, Monash and the Australian Resilience Centre, trying to kind of put people back into critical infrastructure using the idea of lifelines. And I'm happy to talk about that further. At the same time, I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that you've got really, really particular cases of criticality as well. And one of them was very much brought home to me when I did a piece of work with Elspeth Opperman up in the Northern Territory. She was at Charles Darwin U, and looking at how they're coping with the incredible heat stress that's building there. And so this is a huge militarised, increasingly militarised zone. It's a huge zone of different competing fossil fuel infrastructure. And at the same time, it is increasingly reliant on air-conditioned spaces or cocoons or, cabins, as Simon Marvin would talk about. So this kind of series of interlocked air-conditioned cabins. So it might be your ute, it might be the office, it might be the mall, it might be your house, etc. But people exist. And so the combination of things means that blackouts are increasingly a risk up there. And while many blackouts can be fixed remotely, there are many cases where you actually need people outside to actually get up there and fix things physically, take out the burnt bits, put in the new bits, etc. Usually wearing very, very heavy protective gear, which is in and of itself a source of enormous heat. And what we found working with exercise physiologists is that the period of time that these workers are able to actually do that work without themselves actually collapsing from heat stress is reducing down to minutes. So they are up there working, and then they have to escape back into the cabin of the ute to eat ice, cool down, get up there. So the fragility of this system to restore the energy system that keeps the electricity flowing to get the air conditioning going and allows the whole system to work is incredibly fragile. Okay, I'm going too slowly. I have to stop talking and switch to. So at the same time, of course, we need social infrastructure. We all know that social infrastructure, and there's a large area of disaster risk reduction research around these. Daniel Aldrich, for example, talking about the importance of social infrastructure as probably the most important variable when it comes to less negative disaster outcomes, your degree of social infrastructure or social capital. We looked at this for the New South Wales government in the form of community sport. Community sport's often put out there as a kind of source of adaptive capacity. It's so good, people get together, they meet their neighbours, they know everyone. Not to mention that they kind of let off steam and they get physically healthy. It's kind of a win-win-win kind of situation. But when it's rolled out as the solution, as a form of climate change adaptation, what you forget is that it is and of itself vulnerable to climate change, highly vulnerable, because it's basically run by volunteers. At the same time, its physical infrastructure is just as exposed as any natural resource sector. It's out there, generally outside, as well as increasingly there's some inside as well. So we looked at this community sport, and the main thing here is this quote here that what we found is that the community sport workers are being highly affected. And while the government's pumping a large amount of money into rebuilding infrastructure, post-fire, post-flood, coming in there, synthetic grass, which is, arguably maladaptive, but, you've got a whole lot of stuff going on. What they're not rebuilding is communities that actually run the competitions, that actually coach the kids, that actually, turn around and make it all happen. And so that is where the key, fault line is, if you like. And that, because of the role of community sport in adaptive capacity, particularly in rural communities, is a major, I think, national crisis. Okay, community sport's not all there is. Of course, you also have things like schools. We all know the situation. But again, if you take teachers out of schools because they can't get to work, because their house was flooded, because the school shut down for a period of time, because they're precariously employed, etc., then you can imagine already the huge flow-on effects, partly because they're so important in that social infrastructure as well as their formal role. And so that brings me to the last point here, which is about why we need to focus on work in a much more holistic way, which is what does different work achieve? We need a more discerning idea about this. So it's not just workers as individuals who happen to be in the workplace when they're impacted. It's not just about keeping money circulating in the economy, as important as that might be. It's not just about the fact that you're a node in a system and you're useful to me, and would you goddamn, just get on there and fix that IT issue. It's driving me crazy. It's also because different sorts of work are actually fundamental to our very social ecological foundations. So this image here is an environmental group restoring the riverbanks around Lismore. It's the sort of thing that doesn't, count on a critical infrastructure inventory, but arguably, this is everything. It's the river, it's the banks, it's the people of all ages as well. But it's also more, and yet there's more. It's more because not only does this work sit at the foundations of society and our future well-being, reducing vulnerabilities across any number of climate change hazards. But also, if we lose this work, we lose the insights that comes from being part of that work. So if riskscapes are created by what we learn, what we know, the work that we do, and these are people that work in the foundations, then we need them and their insights. And of course, Australian Indigenous communities are a key among these foundational workers, if I can use that phrase. Then we actually, this is the riskscape we need to be seeing and listening to. It's the one we need to be adopting. So what outcomes, but also what insights do we lose if this work can't continue? If we stopped all ecological restoration work, not only would we have ecological outcomes, we would have these social and intellectual outcomes. Sorry, I've got too many screens. So, skip over that. So that's the situation, that's what we need. So what adaptation work is emerging? So let's just flip to say, okay, well, if that's what we need, what have we got? Well, what have we got is slightly different. And I'm kind of sketching this in overly simplistic terms, but it's just to kind of make the point that I really do think there is an important gap here. So what is the actual climate change adaptation work? If we're going to pop that label on something, what jobs would we put that label on? Well, there's a range of literature that looks at this, particularly among local government policy makers. Sometimes people now have resilience adaptation in their title. There's clearly people working in it in the sort of climate science mode, policy makers in it, insurers, engineers, urban planners, etc. There's a range of kind of standard professions that have kind of somehow implicitly been given the Guernsey by society to say, right, go forth and adapt for all of us. Thank you. There's also signs of an adaptation profession in the US. There's something called actually the American Association of Adaptation Professionals. At the same time, we know that this is a highly dynamic space, so it's important to look at lead indicators. So one lead indicator is job ads. So last year we analysed some job ads, see who's advertising for climate change adaptation work. Seek.com sort of thinks this is actually a current opportunity. So if anyone's feeling a bit disenfranchised with academia and interested in climate change advisor or Sydney Water, put your hand up. And what we found is that the work that's being advertised is work that tends to be in quite well-resourced, quite major organisations, usually urban-based, and that's meant to be in the professional services and climate risk management. So why does this matter? First of all, there's a political economic argument here about who's getting rewarded to do this, who's actually benefiting from climate change adaptation work, and implicitly which areas of society, which sectors are being adapted. So when you have certain sectors dominating climate change adaptation roles, there's an implicit assumption there you could make that actually they're focusing in on things that matter to their profession. So an urban planning professional is going to work on the built environment. A health professional, and they're usually in the sort of biomedical health side of things, will work on health outcomes and health systems. All these things are important. I'm not arguing they're not important, but it's just, I guess, so partial. The other piece, again, is this risk-scope thing, because what we've got is a highly dynamic thing where the intellectual concept of climate change adaptation is being crafted in this process. So the very idea of what is adaptation, what's legitimate, what's rational, what's the best practice, we use that, hear that phrase, which is in itself a kind of captured by a certain perspective on the world. The very idea of adaptation is being crafted by the generation of paid work by a set of experts. And so that's just something we need to be critically aware of. 2 minutes, yeah. Second one. So just to link back, as I mentioned at the start, one of the things here is that, across these different areas of work, there is a mode of operating, a mode of organising work known as consulting. And it is not in and of itself a bad thing. I do my fair share of it. I've done it in the past. But at the same time, it's about noticing that it comes with a particular professional lens, and that's commodification, privatisation of it, as well as, really focusing in on what people want you to focus on. So there's an amplification. Consultants amplify others' concerns, and usually they amplify the concerns of those with the biggest wallets. So that in itself, again, it's this narrowing effect. I should have had an image of a funnel. I feel like we're being funneled in a way that is out of step with the wide foundational work that actually is required to reduce climate change impacts and sustain well-being. And so this question is, are the systems that we're protecting through these processes and these feedbacks the ones that we need? And I don't think they are. So, and I'll just kind of finish up here with this wonderful piece of work by Frances Flanagan, who I'm sure you know is just a hero of mine. This beautiful piece she talks about how when we reflect on climate change, particularly in the context of COVID, we see that actually perhaps the biggest question we need to ask is what does climate change mean for our work order? How do we organise work, the hierarchies of work, who gets to call yourself, a different role? What's the, actual elemental way in which we need to value and organise work? And so I think, as I said, it requires social scientists working across a huge range of different disciplines to really tackle this question of revaluing and reorganising work. But that, I think, is what climate change adaptation requires. I'll leave it there.